What if the man who promised you forever becomes the one to shatter your world? For Amelia, her fairy tale life with billionaire shipping magnate Julian Croft turned into a waking nightmare the moment she shared the news of her pregnancy. He didn't just ask her to leave their Manhattan penthouse overlooking Central Park. He banished her. Cast out and pregnant, Amelia's only crime was carrying the heir to the Croft empire. But a secret sealed with a faded wax stamp and hidden for years was about to change everything. A letter from Julian's late father, addressed not to him, but to the woman he just made homeless. Stay with us as we unravel a story of love, betrayal, and a dead man's final shocking confession. The world didn't just know the name Julian Croft, they revered it. It was a name synonymous with power, etched onto the hulls of 1,000 cargo ships that sliced through the world's oceans, a name that echoed in the boardrooms of global finance, a name that afforded a life of almost obscene luxury. At 35, Julian was the master of this empire, a legacy inherited from his formidable father, Alistair Croft. He was sharp, ruthless in business, and possessed a cool, collected demeanor that rarely betrayed the machinations of his mind. His wife Amelia was the perfect complement to his steely exterior. She was the art historian with a gentle soul and a smile that could disarm world leaders, a grace that made the cavernous halls of their Fifth Avenue penthouse feel like a home. They were the city's golden couple, their lives a curated masterpiece of charity galas, exclusive art auctions, and winters in St. Bart's. From the outside, their marriage was as flawless as the Hope Diamond, a dazzling spectacle of wealth and affection. But a gilded cage, no matter how beautiful, is still a cage. The first crack in the flawless facade appeared on a Tuesday evening under the soft ambient glow of a custom-designed Murano glass chandelier. The air was thick with the scent of white peonies, Amelia's favorite, and the distant muted symphony of New York City traffic 20 floors below. Julian had just closed a multi-billion-dollar deal involving the acquisition of a rival shipping line in Singapore. He was in a rare, expansive mood, a small, satisfied smile playing on his lips as he swirled a 25-year-old Macallan in his crystal tumbler. Amelia watched him from across the marble fireplace, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She had been rehearsing this moment for days, the words catching in her throat each time. Her hand instinctively went to her stomach, a gesture that was becoming more frequent, more protective. She was 2 months pregnant. 2 months of holding a secret that was both a wellspring of profound joy and a source of gnawing anxiety. Julian had always been specific about his timeline. A child was in the 5-year plan, but not yet. He was still consolidating power, still fortifying the Croft empire against the relentless tides of the global market. A child, in his view, was a distraction, a vulnerability he wasn't yet prepared to entertain. Amelia began, her voice a little shakier than she would have liked. He looked up, his grey eyes the color of a stormy sea, fixing on her. "Yes, I have something to tell you. Something wonderful." She saw a flicker of something in his eyes, not excitement, but a guarded curiosity. He placed his glass down on the polished mahogany table with a soft click. "Go on. I'm pregnant." The words hung in the air, seemingly sucked into the vast, opulent space around them, swallowed by the silence. The wonderful, life-altering news was met with an unnerving stillness. The smile on Julian's face didn't just vanish. It was as if it had been chiseled away, leaving behind a cold, hard mask. "You're what?" he asked, his voice dangerously low. Pregnant, she repeated, a tremor of fear now lacing her voice. She tried to smile, to convey the miracle of it. "We're going to have a baby, Julian." He stood up, his tall, imposing figure casting a long shadow across the room. He walked towards the floor-to-ceiling windows, his back to her, presenting a formidable, unreadable silhouette against the glittering cityscape. "That's not possible." He stated the words, clipped and precise. "What do you mean?" "Of course, it's possible. It's happening." Amelia's confusion was quickly being replaced by a sickening dread. This was not the reaction she had ever in her wildest nightmares anticipated. He turned around slowly, his face a thunderous mask. "I mean, it was not part of the plan. We discussed this, Amelia, explicitly. Not for another 2 years at least. It happened, Julian. Sometimes these things aren't planned. It's a gift." "A gift," he scoffed, a bitter, humorless sound. "It's a complication. A significant, ill-timed complication. I'm in the middle of the most critical expansion phase of this company's history. My focus cannot be divided." Amelia felt a cold wave of disbelief wash over her. "A complication? Julian, this is our child. This isn't a business negotiation. This is our life, our family." "The Croft family," he retorted, his voice rising, "is synonymous with the Croft Empire. One cannot be jeopardized for the other. My father taught me that. Legacy is paramount, and a legacy is built on strength, on control, not on careless accidents." The word accident struck her like a physical blow. Her hand, which had been resting on her stomach, now felt heavy, as if she were protecting something fragile from an imminent threat. "It wasn't an accident," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "Then what was it, Amelia? A deliberate act of defiance, a way to force my hand." His accusations were growing more ludicrous, more hurtful. "How can you even think that?" she cried, the tears now streaming freely down her face. "I thought you would be happy. I thought this was what we both wanted eventually." "Eventually is not. Now," he thundered, his voice echoing in the vast room. He started pacing, his movements agitated, predatory. "You have been careless. You have put everything at risk." "What is everything, Julian? The money, the company, is that all that matters to you?" "Yes," he roared, stopping abruptly to glare at her. The raw, unvarnished ambition in his eyes was terrifying. It was a side of him she had seen him direct at business rivals, but never at her. "It is what has given us this life. It is what secures our future, your future." "And what about the future of our baby?" she sobbed. He stared at her, his jaw tight, his mind clearly working through calculations she couldn't fathom. The silence stretched on, thick with her heartbreak and his cold fury. When he finally spoke again, his voice was devoid of all emotion, as chilling as the winter wind whipping around the penthouse. "You will not have this baby." The words were so shocking, so monstrous, that for a moment Amelia was sure she had misheard him. "What? What did you say?" "You will terminate the pregnancy," he stated, as if he were issuing a business directive. "There are clinics, the best in the world. It can be handled discreetly. No one needs to know." Amelia felt the floor drop from beneath her. The man she loved, the man she had built a life with, was asking her to extinguish the new life growing inside her. It was a level of cruelty she had never thought possible. "No," she said, her voice small but firm. "What did you say to me?" he growled, taking a menacing step closer. "No," she repeated louder this time, a spark of defiance igniting within her. She wiped her tears away with a fierce gesture. "I will not kill our child, Julian." His face contorted into a mask of pure rage. "Then you are a fool. You have made your choice." "Yes, I have. I choose my baby. Then you have chosen to have it without the Croft name, without the Croft resources. He walked over to his desk, his movements sharp and decisive. He pulled out a checkbook, the same one he used for multi-million-dollar charitable donations, and scribbled on it furiously. He tore the check out and held it out to her. This should be sufficient for your expenses. Now, I want you out of this house. Amelia stared at the check, then back at his unyielding face. The casual cruelty of the gesture, the transactional nature of his dismissal, shattered the last vestiges of the love she had for him. You're throwing me out. Your pregnant wife. You are no longer my wife in any meaningful sense, he said coldly. You have defied me on the most fundamental level. You have proven your loyalty lies elsewhere. I will have my lawyers draw up the divorce papers. They will be delivered to you wherever you decide to go. I have nowhere to go, she whispered, the reality of her situation crashing down on her. Her family was in California, and she had, at Julian's subtle insistence, distanced herself from most of her old friends. Her life had become so intertwined with his that she had no independent foothold. That is no longer my concern, he said, his voice as final as a judge's gavel. He gestured towards the grand, ornate doors of the penthouse. The doorman can call you a cab. I want you gone within the hour. He turned his back on her, then returning to the window once again, the unmovable silhouette against the city lights. The conversation was over. Her life as Mrs. Julian Croft was over. Numb with shock and grief, Amelia walked out of the room. She didn't pack a bag. She didn't take any of the designer clothes or priceless jewelry he had lavished upon her. She took only her purse, the ultrasound photo tucked safely in her wallet, and the crushing weight of her new reality. As she waited for the private elevator, its golden doors gleaming mockingly at her, she took one last look at the opulent prison she had called home. Downstairs, the doorman, a kind-faced man named George, who had always greeted her with a warm smile, looked at her with pity in his eyes. He had clearly been given instructions. "A cab, Mrs. Croft?" he asked softly. "Yes, please, George," she managed to say, her voice cracking. As the yellow cab pulled away from the curb, Amelia looked up at the towering skyscraper, a beacon of wealth and power. In one of those glittering windows was the man who had promised to love and protect her, the father of her child, who had just banished her into the cold, indifferent night. The rain began to fall, blurring the city lights into a watercolor of sorrow. Her fairy tale had ended, and she was utterly, terrifyingly alone. Little did she know, in a dusty, forgotten corner of that very same penthouse, locked away in a safe Julian had never bothered to open, lay a letter from the man whose legacy Julian was so desperate to protect. A letter written by Alistair Croft, addressed not to his powerful son, but to a woman he had never met, Amelia. And within its aging pages lay a secret that would not just unravel Julian's carefully constructed world, but would redefine the very meaning of the Croft legacy. The storm was just beginning. The first few weeks were a blur of cheap motel rooms and the acrid smell of antiseptic cleaner. The check Julian had so disdainfully thrust at her remained untouched in her purse. It felt like blood money, a final insulting severance package for a life and a love that had been terminated as clinically as a business contract. Amelia, who had once debated the merits of a Monet versus a Manet for her drawing room, now found herself counting the loose change in her wallet to see if she could afford a hot meal. The city that had once been her playground now felt alien and hostile. The towering skyscrapers that had symbolized ambition and success now seemed to mock her, their glittering facades, hiding a million stories none of which she was a part of anymore. She was a ghost in a city that had once worshipped her. The society pages that had once chronicled her every move were now silent. She had simply disappeared. She found a small one-room apartment in a walk-up building in Greenwich Village, a world away from the rarefied air of Fifth Avenue. The paint was peeling, the floorboards creaked with every step, and the constant wail of sirens was a stark contrast to the hushed elegance she had known. But it was hers, a sanctuary, however humble, where she could begin to piece together the shattered fragments of her life. She started looking for work, a humbling experience for someone whose last job had been managing the acquisitions for a private art gallery, a position she had left shortly after her marriage. Her resume, with its references to Sotheby's and Christie's, seemed out of place in the small independent galleries she now frequented. They saw the name Amelia Croft, and their eyes would either widen with recognition or narrow with suspicion. She soon realized that the name once her golden ticket was now a liability. She started using her maiden name, Amelia Hayes, but the ghost of her former life was hard to shake. Meanwhile, back in the sterile grandeur of the penthouse, Julian Croft was drowning in silence. He had expected to feel a sense of relief, of restored order. He had excised the complication, reasserted control. The empire was secure, and yet an unnerving quiet had descended upon his gilded cage. The vast rooms once filled with the soft echo of Amelia's laughter, or the gentle melody of the piano she loved to play, were now eerily silent. The scent of white peonies had been replaced by the sterile, impersonal smell of lemon polish used by the cleaning staff. He threw himself into his work with a renewed ferocity, his days a whirlwind of meetings, conference calls, and ruthless negotiations. He was the shark, always moving, always hunting, because to stop would be to acknowledge the gnawing emptiness that was beginning to consume him. He told himself it was a temporary side effect of a necessary amputation. Amelia had been a weakness, an emotional liability he could no longer afford. His father, Alistair, had never allowed sentiment to cloud his judgment. Alistair Croft had been a titan, a man carved from granite and ambition. He had built the Croft shipping empire from a single rust-bucket freighter into a global behemoth. He was a demanding, often distant father who had groomed Julian not with affection, but with a relentless barrage of lessons on power control and the sanctity of the family legacy. "The business is the family, Julian," he would say, his voice a low rumble. "And the family is the business. Never forget that." Julian had never forgotten. He had lived his life by that mantra. One evening, unable to bear the oppressive silence of the main living area, Julian found himself wandering down a long, quiet corridor to a part of the penthouse he rarely visited, his late father's study. Alistair had passed away 2 years prior, and the room had been preserved exactly as he had left it, a shrine to the man who had shaped Julian's world. The room was a stark contrast to the modern minimalist aesthetic of the rest of the penthouse. It was a place of old-world power, dark mahogany walls, shelves lined with leather-bound books on maritime law and ancient naval history, a large, imposing desk, and a faint, lingering scent of cigar smoke and old paper. Julian ran his hand over the worn leather of his father's armchair, the same chair where Alistair had spent countless nights poring over shipping manifests and stock market reports. It was here that Julian had received his harshest lessons and his most coveted praise. It was here he had both feared and revered his father. He felt a strange pull to the room, now a desire to connect with the source of his own unyielding principles. Perhaps here he would find a reaffirmation that he had done the right thing. His eyes scanned the meticulously organized desk, the collection of antique sextants on the mantelpiece, the framed photographs of ships bearing the Croft name. Then his gaze fell upon a large, formidable-looking safe tucked away in a shadowed corner behind the desk. It was an old ironclad model, a relic from a bygone era, with a complex combination dial. Julian had never known the combination. It was Alistair's private domain, a place where he kept his most important documents, his most guarded secrets. Julian had never had a reason to open it. He had his own safes, his own secrets. He had assumed it contained old business deeds, stock certificates, things that his father's lawyers had already accounted for after his death. But now, in the unnerving quiet of his new solitary life, the safe seemed to beckon to him. It was a final, unopened chapter of his father's life, a last bastion of the man's closely guarded mind. He circled the safe, running his fingers over the cold, unyielding steel. "What secrets did you keep, old man?" he wondered. "What final piece of wisdom did you lock away from the world?" He felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to open it, to unlock the last mysteries of Alistair Croft. He called his head of security, a man who could crack any digital fortress, but was initially baffled by the old-world mechanics of the safe. It took 2 days for a specialist, a quiet, elderly man, with the delicate touch of a watchmaker, to be brought in. "It's a Crichton & Sons, a 1948 model," the old man had said, his voice filled with reverence. "They don't make them like this anymore, built to withstand a blitz." Julian watched with an impatient fascination as the old man worked his ear, pressed against the cold steel, his fingers coaxing the tumblers into alignment with a series of soft, precise clicks. Finally, with a heavy, satisfying thud, the lock disengaged. The massive iron door swung open with a low groan. The inside of the safe was not filled with gold bars or bearer bonds, as Julian might have half expected. Instead, it was filled with papers, stacks of them, old letters bound with faded ribbon, journals with worn leather covers, a few velvet pouches containing what looked like military medals. It was a time capsule of his father's life, a life beyond the balance sheets and boardrooms. Julian dismissed the safecracker and closed the study doors, a sense of both trespass and entitlement warring within him. He began to sift through the contents, a historian delving into the artifacts of a lost civilization. He found letters from his mother, written during their courtship, filled with a warmth and passion he had never witnessed between his parents. He found his father's service records from his time in the Merchant Navy, a period of his life Alistair had rarely spoken of. He found journals filled with his father's elegant, forceful script, detailing his early struggles, his triumphs, his ruthless tactics. Julian read with a sense of vindication. Here was the proof, the cold, hard pragmatism, the belief that sentiment was a fatal flaw. His father had made difficult choices, had cut people out of his life who had threatened his ambitions. He had done the right thing with Amelia. He was his father's son. He spent hours in that room, losing track of time, absorbed in the private history of the man he had tried so hard to emulate. He was about to close the safe, a sense of grim satisfaction settling over him, when his fingers brushed against a single thick envelope, tucked away at the very back, almost hidden from view. It was different from the others. The envelope was made of heavy, cream-colored vellum, the kind reserved for the most important correspondence. The wax seal on the back was unbroken, a deep crimson stamped with the Croft family crest. But it was the name on the front that made Julian's blood run cold. It was written in his father's unmistakable hand, the ink slightly faded, but still perfectly clear. It was not addressed to him or to his lawyers, or to anyone he could have possibly imagined. It was addressed to Amelia. Julian stared at the envelope, his mind reeling. Amelia. Why his father had been dead for 2 years. He had only met Amelia a handful of times, polite but perfunctory encounters at family gatherings. What could his father possibly have to say to his wife, a woman he barely knew? And why was it locked away in his most private safe, a wave of unease far more potent than the quiet loneliness that had been haunting him washed over Julian? He held the letter in his hand, the heavy paper feeling like a lead weight. Every instinct, every lesson his father had ever taught him screamed at him to burn it, to destroy this anomaly, this deviation from the known narrative. But a stronger, more unsettling curiosity took hold. The seal was unbroken. The secret was still contained within. With trembling hands, Julian broke the crimson seal. He pulled out the folded pages, the paper crisp and cool to the touch. He took a deep breath, the air in the silent tomb-like room suddenly feeling thick and heavy, and he began to read the last words of Alistair Croft, addressed to the pregnant wife his son had just banished from their family home. The words that would detonate the very foundations of his world. The heavy vellum crackled in Julian's trembling hands. The air in the study, once a sanctuary of his father's unassailable legacy, now felt suffocating, charged with the energy of a long-dormant secret. He unfolded the pages, his eyes scanning the familiar authoritative script that had dictated the course of his entire life. But these words were not for him. They were for Amelia. My dearest Amelia, the salutation alone was a jolt, a shocking intimacy that felt utterly alien. His father had never been a man for endearments. Julian read on his breath, catching in his throat. If you are reading this, it means 2 things. 2. First, that I am gone. And second, that my son Julian has finally married. I pray that he has chosen a woman of substance, of kindness, and of strength. I pray that he has chosen you. You do not know me well, and for that I am deeply sorry. My public persona, the one I curated for the world and even for my own son, was that of a man made of steel and ambition. It was a necessary armor in the world I navigated. But armor, as you know, can become a prison. It is from within that prison that I write this letter, a confession and a plea. Julian's knuckles were white as he gripped the pages. A confession. His father, the infallible Alistair Croft, confessing something. The idea was preposterous. I know my son. I forged him in my own image, or rather in the image I projected. I taught him that the Croft Empire is paramount, that sentiment is a weakness, that control is everything. I fear I may have done my job too well. I fear that in teaching him to be a king, I have forgotten to teach him how to be a man, a husband, a father, and that is where my greatest sin and my greatest regret lies. It is a secret I have carried for over 40 years, a ghost that has haunted every success, every acquisition, every moment of my solitary life. A secret that I fear Julian, in his blind adherence to my teachings, is doomed to repeat. Before I built my empire, before the name Croft was etched on 1,000 ships, I was a young man, a man who fell in love. Her name was Eleanor. She was not from a world of privilege or power. She was a nurse with a spirit as vast and as beautiful as the open sea. We were to be married. She was carrying my child, my firstborn. Julian had to sit down. The leather of his father's chair groaned under his weight. A firstborn, he was Alistair Croft's only son, the sole heir. This was impossible, a lie, a delusion of a dying man. But the letter continued each word, a hammer blow to the edifice of his identity. I was on the cusp of my first major business deal, a precarious venture that required all my capital and all my focus. My own father, a man far colder and more ruthless than I ever became, saw Eleanor and our unborn child as a fatal distraction. He threatened to disown me, to pull the funding that was my only chance at success. He told me to choose the woman I loved, or the legacy I was destined to build. In my youthful arrogance and ambition, I made a choice. The wrong choice. The most unforgivable choice a man can make. I told Eleanor to terminate the pregnancy. I told her she was a complication I could not afford. When she refused, her eyes filled with a strength and a pain I can still see in my darkest nightmares. I gave her money and I sent her away. I banished her, my pregnant love, from my life. I chose the empire over my family. The words on the page blurred. Julian saw not his father's script, but his own reflection. He heard not his father's confession, but the echo of his own cruel words to Amelia. A significant, ill-timed complication. You will terminate the pregnancy. I want you out of this house. It was a script, written a generation ago, a poisonous legacy passed from father to son. He felt a wave of nausea. He, who had prided himself on his own mind, his own decisions, had been nothing but a puppet, dancing on the strings of his father's past sins. He had replicated the very act that his father now confessed as his life's greatest regret. I built my empire. The letter continued, pulling him back into its devastating narrative. I married Julian's mother, a suitable match from a good family, a woman I respected but never truly loved. And I was punished for my choice. We tried for years to have children. The irony was not lost on me. The man who had callously discarded one child was now unable to conceive another. Julian, my only son, was a miracle, born late in our marriage, but he was born into a gilded cage, raised on the cold principles of my own making. Because I was too much of a coward to teach him the truth, I had learned too late. I never saw Eleanor again. I tried to find her years later, when my empire was secure and my loneliness was a cancer in my soul. I hired private investigators, but she had vanished, determined, I am sure, to protect her child from the man who had abandoned them. I do not know if I have a son or a daughter. I do not know if I have grandchildren. I have a global empire, but I do not have my family. I am a king with an empty kingdom. Amelia, I am writing this to you because I have seen in your eyes the same light I once saw in Eleanor's, a light of kindness, of empathy, of a strength that is not forged in boardrooms, but in the heart. Julian will need that light. He will be tested. My teachings have made him rigid, and he may one day face a choice similar to mine. He may see a child not as a blessing, but as a complication. He may see love not as a strength, but as a vulnerability. If that day ever comes, I beg of you, show him this letter. Do not let him make the same mistake I did. Do not let him sacrifice his heart for a crown of gold. The Croft legacy is not the ships or the stock prices. The true legacy, the one I failed to build, is family. It is love. It is the laughter of children in the halls of a home, not the silence of a penthouse. And one more thing. In this safe, you will find a separate sealed envelope. It contains the name of the private investigator I last employed and all his research. It is a slim file, for he found very little, but he did find a birth certificate. A boy. He was born in a small town in upstate New York. His name is Thomas. That is all I know. My son. Julian's brother. Julian's hands were shaking so violently now that the letter fell from his grasp. It fluttered to the floor, the neat script, a damning indictment of his entire life. A brother. He had a brother. A brother born out of the love his father had sacrificed for the very empire Julian now commanded. An empire built on a foundation of lies and regret. He lunged for the safe, his movements frantic. He saw the other envelope thick and sealed, just as his father had described. He tore it open. Inside was a file, and on top, a faded photocopied birth certificate. Thomas Albright, mother Eleanor Albright, father Alastair Croft. The world tilted on its axis. The cold, unshakable certainty that had been the bedrock of his existence crumbled into dust. He wasn't just a monster who had banished his pregnant wife. He was a fool, a blind, arrogant fool who had worshipped a false idol. His father hadn't been a god of commerce to be emulated. He had been a broken man, haunted by a terrible mistake, a mistake he had just repeated with chilling precision. The silence of the penthouse was no longer just an absence of sound. It was a living, breathing entity, filled with the ghosts of the past, with the imagined cries of an abandoned baby, with the echoes of his own brutal words to Amelia. He thought of her alone pregnant, carrying his child, the true Croft legacy. He had cast her out, just as his father had cast out Eleanor. He had called their child a complication. The child who his father's letter now screamed at him was the only thing that truly mattered. A guttural sob escaped his lips, a raw, agonizing sound he hadn't made since he was a small boy. He sank to his knees amidst the scattered papers, the confession of his father, and the evidence of his own catastrophic failure laid bare around him. The letter was not a plea. It was a warning he had received far, far too late. He now knew what he had to do. Finding Amelia was no longer a matter of choice. It was a desperate, burning necessity. He had to find her, not just to beg for her forgiveness, but to save himself from becoming the lonely, regret-filled king his father had been. He had to break the cycle. The question was, could he? And even if he found her, could she ever forgive him? The revelation in his father's study shattered Julian Croft. The man of impenetrable control was gone, replaced by a ghost haunting a penthouse that now felt like a mausoleum. The first day was lost to a haze of whiskey and self-recrimination, the letter a damning verdict on his desk. The cold, calculated logic he had mistaken for strength was revealed for what it was, a hollow inherited fear. On the second day, a new desperate purpose burned through the fog. This wasn't about business. It was about reclaiming his soul. He made a single call to Carter, his ruthlessly efficient head of security. "I need to find my wife, Amelia," Julian said, his voice raw. "Sir, I thought—" "I don't pay you to think," Julian snapped. "I pay you to find people, use every resource, financial, forensics, informants, surveillance. I want to know where she is. Now." The search began, a vast operation focused on a single missing person. But Amelia had vanished. The check he'd given her remained uncashed, her credit cards untouched. It was as if she had been swallowed by the city he owned. Julian paced the length of his empty home, tormented by a single thought: He had systematically isolated Amelia, believing it made her his, and now that very isolation made her impossible to find. He had orchestrated his own private hell. While Julian's world imploded, Amelia's was slowly, painstakingly being rebuilt. She had left his check untouched in her purse, refusing to let his blood money fund her new life. After a few disorienting weeks, she found a small, one-room apartment in a Greenwich Village walk-up, a world away from the rarefied air of Fifth Avenue. The peeling paint and creaking floorboards were the price of her freedom. Here, she was not Mrs. Croft. She was Amelia Hayes, a pregnant woman finding her way. She took a part-time job at The Last Word, a cluttered bookstore owned by a perceptive, kind-hearted woman named Mrs. Gable, who saw the sadness in Amelia's eyes, but also the steel in her spine. Sometimes you have to run for a while to find out where you're supposed to stand, dear, she had told her, asking no further questions. Amelia's fight was a quiet one. It was the daily battle to choose hope over bitterness, to eat for the baby's sake when grief stole her appetite. Her greatest solace came from a support group for single mothers-to-be at a local community center. Listening to their stories, she realized her fall from a great height was just one kind of struggle. These women were navigating hardships she'd never known, yet they were filled with a fierce, protective love for their children that mirrored her own. She was not a pariah. She was part of a tribe. She made a conscious decision to stay a ghost. She used only cash earned from the bookstore and from selling the one piece of simple jewelry she'd kept, earrings from her grandmother. The gaudy diamonds Julian had given her were left behind, like remnants of a costume she would never wear again. She was discovering a strength she never knew she possessed, a resilience forged in the fire of betrayal. She was becoming herself again, and she was realizing she liked this woman far more than the pampered, sheltered wife of a billionaire. Back in his gilded cage, Julian grew more desperate with each failed report from Carter. "It's like she doesn't exist, Mr. Croft," his security chief admitted, baffled. "She's deliberately staying off the grid. She's smart." Julian knew she was. Her intelligence, which he had once admired as an accessory, was now a shield she rightfully used against him. He walked back into his father's study, the room no longer a shrine, but a memorial to a tragic, broken man. He looked at the other file on his desk, the one detailing the fruitless search for his lost brother Thomas. He had two families to find now, two lives fractured by the cold ambition of the Croft name. The weight of it all was crushing, but for the first time, Julian Croft knew what he was truly fighting for. It wasn't for an empire of steel, but for a legacy of flesh and blood. And he would tear his own world apart to find it. The full force of Julian Croft's empire, once used to track container ships and hostile takeovers, was now laser-focused on a single square mile of Manhattan, the West Village. Yet Amelia had vanished. By living off the grid, using cash, and severing ties to her old life, she had become a ghost in the city that was once her kingdom. For weeks, Julian's sophisticated network of operatives found nothing. He paced his silent penthouse, haunted by the specter of his own cruelty and a gnawing fear for the woman carrying his child. The first break came not from high-tech surveillance, but from a simple, personal transaction. Carter, his head of security, called him with the news. "We flagged a sale at a jeweler in the West Village 2 weeks ago. A pair of earrings, not her usual style, simpler. The description matches a pair she wore in older family photos." "It's her." Julian breathed, a desperate hope surging through him. "Focus everything there." The lead pointed them to a community center near the jewelry shop. An operative, bypassing a formal tour, quickly found what he was looking for in the lobby: a flyer for a prenatal support group. On the sign-up sheet, pinned to a corkboard, a single name jumped out, written in a familiar, elegant hand: Amelia. The group meets on Thursdays at 6 p.m., Carter reported. That's tonight. I'm going, Julian said, instantly, his voice leaving no room for argument. Alone. That evening, Julian sat in his car across the street from the center, his hands gripping the wheel. He had faced down corporate raiders without flinching, yet the thought of confronting the woman whose life he'd ruined terrified him. Then he saw her. She was walking with a new, quiet strength he'd never seen before. She wasn't dressed in designer clothes, but she radiated a grace that no amount of money could buy. He watched as she paused, placing a hand on her small, definite bump, a protective gesture that sent a wave of profound regret through him. This was the life he had tried, to erase the miracle he had called a complication. He waited until she disappeared inside before getting out of the car, his heart pounding. Inside the shabby, brightly lit community center, he felt like an invader. The receptionist pointed him toward room 2B, adding that the meeting would be over soon. But Julian couldn't wait. The door was slightly ajar, and he could hear the warm murmur of voices and laughter from within. He stood outside, listening, a ghost, at the edge of her new life. Then he heard her voice, and it stopped his breath. I actually found a place for the crib today, Amelia was saying, her tone filled with a simple, genuine joy. It's just a little corner of my apartment, but I was standing there picturing it, and for the first time, it felt like a real home for us. The words were a dagger to Julian's heart. For us. She was building a home for their child, a sanctuary he had no part in, one he had forced her to create from the ashes of the life he'd destroyed. He couldn't stand it. He pushed the door open. The conversation died instantly. A dozen pairs of eyes turned to stare at him. Then Amelia looked up. Her happy, animated expression vanished, replaced by pale, cold shock. She instinctively wrapped her arms around her stomach, a shield against the man who had shattered her world. Amelia, he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. Her own voice when she found it was brittle. What are you doing here, Julian? How did you find me? I had people looking, he stammered, feeling exposed under the collective glare of the room. Of course you did, she said, with a bitter smile. The billionaire and his hounds. One of the other women stood up, her expression fierce. I think you should leave. You're not welcome here. Please, Julian begged, his eyes fixed only on Amelia. I need to talk to you. I found something. Something you have to see. He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out the thick vellum envelope. It looked absurdly out of place, a relic from a world of secrets and power. He held it out to her. It's from my father, he said, his voice cracking. It's addressed to you. Amelia stared at the letter, her mind reeling. My father, he's been dead for 2 years. I know, Julian said. He left it for you. Amelia, please, you have to read this. It explains everything. The room was utterly silent. The impossible letter, Julian's raw desperation, the story that hung unspoken in the air, it was enough. Amelia looked at his haunted face and saw that the cold, arrogant man who had banished her was gone, replaced by someone she didn't recognize. With a shuddering breath, she stood. It's okay, she whispered to the other women, her silent tribe. She walked toward Julian, her gaze hard and unforgiving, and gestured to the hall. Outside, he followed her into the empty corridor, the letter clutched in his hand. On the words inside, he knew rested the entire weight of his past and any hope he had for a future. The corridor of the community center was a sterile, silent stage for their confrontation. Amelia stood with her arms crossed, a fragile barrier against him. Her face was a mask of hurt, her eyes turbulent with suspicion. "Give it to me," she said, her voice flat and cold. Julian handed her the heavy vellum envelope. His fingers brushed against hers, a fleeting touch that felt like an electric shock. He watched as she examined the unbroken croft seal and saw the flicker of confusion as she registered her own name written in Alistair's hand. "It was in his private safe," Julian explained, his voice raw. "I was looking for an answer, I suppose, and I found this." Amelia leaned against the wall, her expression guarded, as she broke the seal. Julian watched her face, the only verdict that mattered. He saw the subtle widening of her eyes as she read about Eleanor, the secret love, the first child. He saw her lips part in a silent gasp of dawning, horrified realization. Her hand instinctively went to her own stomach, a gesture of profound, sudden connection to a woman she'd never met. She looked up from the letter, her eyes wide. "My God, Julian," she whispered the words barely audible. This is what you did. To me." "Yes," he said the single word, a heavy confession of his own. "I did the exact same thing. I was reading from a script I never knew existed." She returned to the pages, her gaze flying across the script, absorbing his father's regret, his loneliness, and his desperate plea. When she reached the part about his brother Thomas Albright, a small, choked sob escaped her. The hard, defensive mask on her face finally crumbled, replaced by a profound sadness. It was a sadness for him, for his father, for Eleanor, and for the child that had almost suffered the same fate. "All this time," she said, her voice soft and filled with a sorrow that was almost worse than her anger. "All this time, you were so obsessed with his legacy. You worshipped him, but you didn't even know the man." "No," Julian admitted, his own voice thick with emotion. "I worshipped a fiction, a myth of a man who was in the end just as broken as I am." He took a hesitant step closer. "Amelia, when I read that letter, it was like looking in a mirror. I saw the man I was becoming, a lonely, regretful king in an empty kingdom. And I was disgusted by him." Her eyes, sharp and intelligent, even through her tears, cut straight to the heart of the matter. "Why did you look for me, Julian? Did you look because you were afraid of ending up like him?" It was a crucial question, and he owed her nothing less than the brutal truth. "At first, yes," he said honestly. "Reading that letter terrified me. But as I looked for you as days went by, and I couldn't find you, it changed. It stopped being about me. I thought about you alone. I thought about our baby. I wasn't just trying to avoid my father's fate. I was trying to find the best part of myself, which I threw away when I sent you away." He gestured back towards the now silent meeting room. "Hearing you in there, talking about the crib, about making a home for us, I realized I hadn't just thrown away a wife. I had thrown away my family, the only thing my father in the end realized ever mattered." He looked at her, his vulnerability absolute. "I know I'm sorry is a meaningless phrase compared to what I did. I have no right to ask for anything. Not for your forgiveness, not for a second chance. My only plan is to try and be a father. Our child deserves a father. Let me be there, Amelia. Let me come to the appointments. Let me earn back your trust. Let me show you and our child that I can break this miserable cycle." Amelia looked at the desperate, broken man before her, stripped of his power and pride. He was a man drowning in regret, clinging to a fragile hope for redemption. She thought of the men in her support group who had walked away without a backward glance. Julian had done that, but he had come back. He had come back, armed not with excuses, but with a devastating truth. She knew the path forward would be fraught with pain and mistrust, but in his eyes she saw a flicker of the man she had first loved. In her heart, where there had been only anger, a tiny fragile seed of hope began to sprout. She carefully folded the letter and held it out to him. "You keep it," she said softly, "as a reminder." She paused, taking a deep, shuddering breath as she made her decision. "The next appointment is on Tuesday," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "At 10 o'clock, I'll text you the address." It wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't a reunion, but it was a beginning, a tiny crack of light in the darkness. For Julian, it felt like the sun. He could only nod, unable to speak, as a single tear traced a path down his cheek. Amelia turned and walked back to her friends, her tribe, leaving Julian standing in the corridor. He was alone, but for the first time in his life, he didn't feel lonely. He felt a sense of purpose. The work ahead was harder than any corporate negotiation, but it was the only deal that mattered. Now, rebuilding a life, earning back a love he never deserved, and finally, becoming the man his father had prayed his son would be. The king was dead. Long live the father. And so the story of Julian and Amelia doesn't end with a fairy tale kiss, but with something far more real, a chance. A chance to break a destructive cycle, to redefine a legacy, not with wealth, but with worth. Julian's journey was just beginning. The search for his lost brother, the slow, painful process of earning back Amelia's trust, and the profound transformation from a ruthless billionaire to a devoted father. Their story reminds us that the greatest empires we can build are the families we nurture and the love we choose to fight for, even after we've broken it. It's a powerful lesson that the sins of the father don't have to become the blueprint for the son, and that even the most shattered lives can be rebuilt piece by painful, hopeful piece. Thank you for joining us for this emotional journey. If this story touched your heart, please let us know in the comments below. What do you think Julian should do next? Don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who loves a story of redemption, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more compelling tales of drama, love, and the secrets that define us. We'll see you next time.